Thrown out at 16, he was forced to hide his sister in the loft of an abandoned barn. But what he discovered buried beneath the floorboards would not only save them, but prove his grandmother's final, desperate act was one of fierce protection. If you've ever felt like the world had given up on you, or if you've ever had to fight for the only thing that mattered, I think this story might be for you. Stick around, and if it hits home, maybe subscribe, because we tell stories here for people who know what it's like to find light in the darkest of places. The day I turned 18, nobody threw me a party. There was no cake, no off-key singing, no awkward pile of gifts. My birthday was marked by a cardboard box and a signature. The box held everything I owned: 3 changes of clothes, a worn copy of a book my grandmother used to read to me, a cracked photo of her standing with me and my sister Maya, and a toothbrush. The signature was mine, scrawled on a document that officially released me from the custody of the state of Oregon. I was an adult. I was free. It felt exactly like being pushed out of a moving car. I stood on the curb outside the group home, the place they'd called a transitional living facility, and watched the door click shut behind me. For 2 years, that door had been my horizon. 2 years of fluorescent lights that hummed with a sound like dying insects. 2 years of schedules taped to the wall, of mandatory group sessions where we talked about our feelings until the feelings themselves felt processed and packaged, like cheap cheese. 2 years of missing my sister so much it felt like a physical part of me had been amputated. Now, the door was just a door. The building was just a building, and I was just a guy on a sidewalk with a box and $74 in his pocket. The air was cold, that specific damp cold of a Pacific Northwest morning in late October. It smelled of wet leaves and exhaust fumes. I pulled the collar of my thin jacket up, a useless gesture against the chill that had already sunk into my bones. Freedom, it turned out, was cold. My plan was simple, because it had to be. Get a job, any job. Find a room to rent, any room. Save every single penny. And then, somehow, navigate the labyrinth of social services and family court to get guardianship of Maya. She was 16. 2 more years in the system for her felt like a life sentence for both of us. We talked on the phone every Sunday, our conversations stilted and monitored. But her voice was the one thing that kept me from sinking. "You're 18 now, Leo," she'd whispered last week, her voice crackling over the cheap phone in the group home's common area. "You can get me out, right? You promised." I promised. It was the only thing I had left that felt real. I started walking, heading for the bus station. The first step was finding work. I'd been washing dishes at a diner downtown, a work release program that ended the second I signed that paper. My old boss, a tired man named Sal, said he'd take me on full-time if I could find a place to live. That was the catch. No address, no job. No job, no address. It was the system's final, perfect little circle. At the station, I bought a coffee I couldn't afford and sat on a hard plastic bench. The $74 was now $69. I opened my box and took out the photo. Grandma, me, and Maya. We were standing in front of the old barn on her property, squinting into the sun. I was 10, all knees and elbows. Maya was 8, missing her 2 front teeth. Grandma stood between us, her arms draped over our shoulders, her face etched with lines, but her eyes clear and fierce. It was taken the summer before everything fell apart, before the cough turned into something worse, before the doctors started shaking their heads, before the words foreclosure and debt started being whispered by the adults. After she was gone, the bank took the farm, and the state took us. They said it was for the best. They put me in one home, Maya in another, 60 miles apart. That was 2 years ago. I tucked the photo back into the book and was about to close the box when I saw it. It was a long, cream-colored envelope, tucked into the side, almost hidden. My name was typed on the front, Leo Vance. Beneath it was the address of the group home. In the top left corner was the name of a law firm, Miller and Finch, attorneys at law. My heart did a slow, heavy thud. Lawyers meant trouble. I'd learned that lesson the hard way. I tore it open, my fingers clumsy with a sudden tremor. The paper inside was thick, expensive. The letter was short. It informed me that, as per the last will and testament of one Eleanor Vance, her property, 40 acres of land and all structures located at 14 Willow Creek Road, was to be transferred to my name upon my 18th birthday. It went on. The property was currently under a significant lien. There were outstanding property taxes amounting to several $1,000s. A private lender held a note against it for an amount that made my vision blur. In summary, the estate was deeply in debt. The county and the lender were both initiating foreclosure proceedings. I had 30 days. 30 days to either satisfy the debts or the property would be auctioned off. Signed, a man named Arthur Finch. I read it again, and a third time. It made no sense. The farm was gone. The bank took it. That's what they told us. They sat us down, me and Maya, in a sterile office with a kind-faced woman who gave us juice boxes and told us Grandma's farm had to be sold to pay for her hospital bills. She'd shown us papers, or maybe she hadn't. I was 14, numb with grief. I just remembered nodding. Now, this. A farm I didn't know I had, a debt I could never pay, and a 30-day countdown. It felt like a joke, a cruel, elaborate prank played by a universe that had already taken everything. My first instinct was to throw the letter away. It was a ghost, a problem from a life that was over. My future was a tiny rented room and a dishwasher, not a 40-acre pile of debt. But then I looked at the photo again. Grandma's clear, fierce eyes. The barn where we'd spent entire summers hiding from the heat. The promise I'd made to Maya. What if this wasn't a prank? What if this was something else? I didn't know what. But for the first time since walking out of that group home, a feeling other than cold dread began to stir in my chest. It wasn't hope, not yet. It was something sharper, curiosity. The bus to my grim, practical future was boarding. I stood up, walked over to the trash can, and held the letter over the opening. Then I stopped. I folded it carefully and put it back in my pocket. I walked to the ticket counter. 1 ticket to Oak Ridge, I said, the town nearest Willow Creek Road, the town I hadn't seen in 2 years. I didn't have a plan. I didn't have any money. All I had was a letter about a ghost farm and the faint, stubborn memory of a promise. The bus ticket cost $22. I was down to 47. It was the stupidest, most irresponsible thing I could have possibly done. And it was the only thing that felt right. The legal jargon swam in my head as I stared out the bus window at the blur of green and gray. Lien, encumbrance, foreclosure. They were adult words, words that belonged to a world of mortgages and responsibilities I was completely unequipped for. According to Mr. Finch's letter, the total debt was just over $80,000. To me, It might as well have been $1 billion. I had $47 and a box of clothes. The absurdity of it was so vast, it was almost funny. Here I was, legally an adult for all of 5 hours, and I was already neck-deep in a financial disaster that had been brewing for years. I tried to make sense of it. Why would Grandma leave me this? She knew she was in debt. We all knew. Towards the end, she was selling off tools, then furniture. She'd been so proud, so stubbornly self-reliant, but the shame had been there, shadowing her eyes when she thought we weren't looking. She wouldn't have wanted to burden me. She would have wanted to protect me, always. That's who she was. The woman who taught me how to read by tracing the words in old seed catalogs. The woman who could fix a tractor engine with sheer willpower and a wrench. The woman who, when I was 7 and terrified of thunderstorms, would take me and Maya out to the barn loft, where the sound of the rain on the tin roof was a drumbeat instead of a threat. She wouldn't leave me a trap. There had to be more to it. The letter stated Miller and Finch had been her legal counsel. I found their number online and called from the bus, my phone's battery already draining. A crisp receptionist put me through to Arthur Finch's voicemail. I left a message, my voice sounding younger and more uncertain than I wanted. "Hi, my name is Leo Vance. I got your letter about my grandmother's property. I have some questions." I didn't know what questions to even ask. How do I fix this? Felt too simple. Why did she do this? Felt too personal. I hung up, feeling foolish. What was a lawyer going to say to a broke kid on a bus? He'd probably tell me to walk away, to let the bank and the county have the land. It was the smart thing to do, the logical thing. But my gut, a part of me I hadn't listened to in years, was pulling me in the opposite direction. It was pulling me home. I remembered the day they took us away. A social worker, the same kind-faced woman, packed our bags for us. She was efficient, quiet. I kept asking when we could go back. "The farm isn't yours anymore, sweetie," she'd said, folding one of Maya's sweaters. "It's for the best." We believed her. We were kids. Why would we question the adults who were supposedly there to help? But now, Mr. Finch's letter said something different. It said the farm was mine. It had been waiting for me in a kind of legal limbo for 2 years. This meant the social worker had lied. Or, more likely, she'd simplified the truth until it became a lie. The farm wasn't sold. It was just drowning. This new fact settled in me, hard and sharp as a piece of glass. They had lied. They had separated me and Maya based on a lie. A quiet rage, cold and clean, began to burn away the fog of my confusion. This wasn't just about debt anymore. This was about truth. When the bus finally pulled into Oak Ridge, the sun was setting. The town looked smaller, sadder than I remembered. Storefronts that had been hardware stores or cafes were now boarded up. The paint on the welcome sign was peeling. It was a town that was slowly giving up. I didn't have money for a cab, so I started the 4-mile walk to Willow Creek Road. The air grew colder as the light failed, the smell of pine and damp earth replacing the town's decay. Every step felt both familiar and alien. I knew this road. I knew the curve of it, the way the big oak tree stood on the hill at the halfway point. But I was seeing it with new eyes now. I wasn't a kid coming home from school. I was a trespasser on my own past. I called Maya from the road. I had to time it perfectly, catching her during the 15-minute free period after dinner and before study hall. When she picked up, her hello was wary. "It's me," I said. "Leo? Where are you? You're not at Sal's." "No, I'm walking to the farm." Silence. then a sharp intake of breath. What? Leo, no. There's nothing there. It's gone. It's not gone, May. It's ours. Grandma left it to me. I tried to explain the letter, the debt, the 30 days. The words came out in a jumble, a mess of legal terms and desperate hope. I could feel her fear through the phone. Leo, that's crazy. It's a trick. You need to come back. You have a job. You have a plan. The plan wasn't working, Maya. I don't know what this is, but it's something. I have to see it. I could hear a supervisor's voice in the background, telling her time was up. Leo, be careful, she whispered, her voice tight with unshed tears. Promise me you'll be careful. I promise, I said, the word tasting like metal in my mouth. Another promise I didn't know if I could keep. The call ended, and the silence of the road rushed back in. Her fear was a heavy cloak on my shoulders. Was she right? Was I chasing a ghost down a dead-end road, wasting time and money I didn't have? Maybe. But as I rounded the final bend and saw the silhouette of the barn against the bruised purple sky, I knew I couldn't have done anything else. This was the place where our story began. If there were any answers, they had to be here. The driveway was overgrown, more of a suggestion than a path. Weeds grew thick and tall through cracks in the asphalt. The gate was gone, one hinge rusted through, the other bent. The farmhouse itself was a dark shape, a wound in the landscape. I approached it slowly, my heart pounding a nervous rhythm against my ribs. The porch sagged dramatically to one side, as if it had given a long sigh and was halfway to collapsing. A blue tarp was stapled over a section of the roof, but it had been shredded by wind and time, flapping in the breeze like a tattered flag of surrender. The windows were dark, and one on the ground floor was broken, a jagged black mouth. I didn't have a key, but the front door was ajar. It scraped against the warped floorboards as I pushed it open. The air that hit me was thick and musty, the smell of trapped time, of dust and damp and decay. It smelled like abandonment. I stepped inside, my footsteps echoing in the silence. Moonlight filtered through the grimy windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The furniture was gone, just as I remembered. But the absence of it was more powerful than its presence ever was. I could see the ghost of Grandma's armchair by the cold fireplace, the phantom shape of the big kitchen table where we ate every meal. This was where she had died, not in a hospital, but here. The social worker told us she'd passed in her sleep. Peaceful, they said. But standing in this cold, empty house, it didn't feel peaceful. It felt lonely. I walked through the rooms, my hand trailing along the dusty walls. The floral wallpaper in her bedroom was peeling away in long strips. A water stain bloomed like a dark, ugly flower on the ceiling in the hallway. In my old room, someone had scrawled graffiti on the wall. The house felt violated. It wasn't a home anymore. It was a crime scene. The grief I thought I had processed, the grief I had packed away in neat little boxes during group therapy, came rushing back. It was raw and overwhelming. I sank to the floor in the middle of the living room, my cardboard box next to me, and I cried. I cried for my grandmother, for the lonely way she must have spent her last days in this failing house. I cried for Maya, trapped in a system that didn't care about her. And I cried for myself, for the 14-year-old boy who lost everything, and the 18-year-old man who had just inherited the wreckage. After a long time, the tears stopped. The cold of the floorboards seeped into my jeans. I was exhausted, hungry, and no closer to an answer. Selling this place seemed impossible. Who would buy a ruin? And even if they did, the debt was more than it could ever be worth. Maya was right. This was a mistake. I should have stayed in the city, washed the dishes, and saved my pennies. I stood up, my body stiff. I couldn't stay in the house. The sadness was too thick. It was suffocating. I picked up my box and headed for the one place that still held good memories: the barn. The massive sliding door was off its track. I had to put my shoulder into it, grunting with effort, to open it just enough to squeeze through. The air inside was different from the house. It smelled of old hay, earth, and engine oil. It was the smell of my childhood. The main floor was filled with shadows. The moonlight coming through the high windows and the gaps in the siding cut the darkness into long, pale strips. I could see the outline of the old tractor, shrouded in a dusty tarp. The empty stalls where Grandma had once kept a couple of milk cows. The workbench, still littered with old tools, rusted but lying where she'd left them. It was a mess, but it was a living mess. It didn't feel dead like the house. It felt dormant. I made my way to the wooden ladder that led to the loft. The rungs were solid under my hands. Climbing it, I felt a strange sense of homecoming. The loft was our kingdom, mine and Maya's. It was where we'd build forts out of hay bales, where we'd dare each other to walk the high beams, where we'd lie on our backs and watch the spiders spin webs in the rafters. It was our sanctuary. It was just as I remembered it. The space was huge, spanning the entire length of the barn. A single large window at the far end looked out over the fields. Hay, decades old, was still piled in one corner. I dropped my box and walked to the window. The moon was high now, casting a silver light over the 40 acres of overgrown pasture. My land, my debt, my problem. I ran a hand over the rough, weathered wood of the window frame. What was I looking for? A hidden safe? A shoebox full of cash? It was a childish fantasy. Real life didn't have secret treasures. Real life had liens and foreclosures. I was about to turn away when my foot scuffed against something. I looked down. The floorboards in the loft were wide, thick planks of Douglas fir, worn smooth by a century of use. But right where I was standing, one board seemed different. It wasn't the color or the texture. It was the fit. The gap around it was slightly wider, and one end was a fraction of an inch higher than its neighbors. I knelt down, my heart starting to beat a little faster. I remembered this board. It was our secret spot. We used to pry it up with a screwdriver to hide things from each other. Comics, cool-looking rocks, notes. It was a game. My fingers trembled as I worked them into the crack. The board was stuck fast. It hadn't been moved in years. I went back down the ladder and rummaged through the tools on Grandma's workbench until I found a sturdy pry bar. Back in the loft, I wedged the tip of the bar into the gap and leaned on it. The wood groaned in protest. Then, with a loud crack, the nails gave way. I lifted the board. It was about 3 feet long. Underneath, there was a dark, square cavity in the subfloor, and nestled inside it was a metal box. It was an old Army surplus ammunition can, painted olive drab, with a heavy latch on the front. It wasn't a shoebox. It was heavy. It was real. I stared at it for a long moment, the pry bar still in my hand. The cold night air felt electric. This was it. This was something. I didn't know if it was the answer I was looking for, but it wasn't nothing. With shaking hands, I reached into the darkness and lifted the box out. It was heavier than I expected, cold, solid, and real. I carried it over to the window, into the moonlight. The latch was stiff, coated with a thin layer of rust. I had to use the pry bar again to force it open. It sprang with a loud metallic clang that echoed through the cavernous barn. I lifted the lid. For a heart-stopping second, I thought it was full of dirt. But as my eyes adjusted, I saw it wasn't dirt. It was paper. It was a stack of envelopes, dozens of them, bundled together with twine. They were addressed to me. "For Leo," the top one said, in my grandmother's familiar spidery handwriting. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't a treasure chest full of money. It was a box full of words. Her words. I sat down on the dusty floorboards, the cold box in my lap, and I pulled out the first bundle. The letters weren't dated with years, only with seasons. "Late summer," the first one began. I unfolded the brittle paper. "My dearest Leo, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you are a man. I hope the world has been kind to you in the years between. I hope you have been kind to yourself. There are things you need to know, things I couldn't tell you and Maya when I was alive." The sickness came on fast, faster than the doctors thought. But the other sickness, the one that was really killing this farm, started long before. It started with a man named Silas Croft. The name meant nothing to me. I read on, my entire body rigid with concentration. "He came to me after your grandfather passed, a nice young man in a suit, offering help. A reverse mortgage, he called it. A way to get cash out of the farm without having to sell. It sounded like a lifeline. I was proud, Leo. Too proud to ask for help from anyone else. So I signed the papers. It was the biggest mistake of my life. The interest rates were criminal. The fees were hidden in pages of fine print I didn't understand. Every month, I owed more. He wasn't offering a lifeline. He was throwing an anchor. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold the paper. This wasn't just bad luck. This wasn't just the inevitable slide of old age and illness. This was deliberate. She had been targeted. I kept reading, letter after letter. She laid it all out, not with self-pity, but with a cold, clear-eyed fury. She described how Croft and his company, a predatory lender called Apex Financial, systematically bled her dry. When she tried to fight it, to refinance with a real bank, she found that the contract she'd signed made it impossible. The debt grew, swallowing the equity in the land whole. "I knew I was dying, Leo," she wrote in a letter marked early winter. "And I knew what would happen when I was gone. They would take the farm for pennies on the dollar to cover the fraudulent debt. And the state would take you and Maya. The thought of you two being separated, that was the only thing that truly terrified me. More than the cancer, more than dying. I couldn't let that happen. A cold dread washed over me. What had she done? The next letter explained it. So I made a plan, a desperate one, a terrible one in some ways. I couldn't save the farm by fighting them head-on. I didn't have the time or the money. So I decided to make the farm worthless. I went back to Apex Financial. I told them I needed more money for medical bills. I took out another loan and another. I let the debt swell until it was an absurd, monstrous number. I stopped paying the property taxes. I let the house fall into disrepair. From the outside, I made it look like the farm was a toxic asset, a black hole of debt that no one in their right mind would ever want. I made it look like there was nothing left to take. I had to stop reading. I stood up and paced the length of the loft, my mind reeling. The story we'd been told, that Grandma had lost the farm to medical bills, was a lie. But it was a lie she had built herself. The debt wasn't a sign of her failure, it was a shield. A scorched earth defense designed to make the vultures lose interest. She had sacrificed her own legacy, the reputation of the farm she and Grandpa had built from nothing, to protect us. To keep the vultures away from the one thing that truly mattered. But what was it? What was she protecting? The farm itself was ruined. I went back to the box. There were more letters. One, near the bottom, was in a different kind of envelope, a business envelope. It was addressed not to me, but to Silas Croft. It was sealed. I opened it. The letter inside was dated only a week before her death. Mr. Croft, you think you have won. You think you will pick the bones of my home for scrap. You are wrong. I have taken your poison and used it to inoculate my legacy. This farm may look like a pile of debt to you now, but you of all people should know that appearances can be deceiving. I have left my grandson something far more valuable than land. I have left him the truth, and I have left him a choice. He can walk away, and you will get a patch of worthless, ruined dirt. Or he can fight, and if he fights, he will not be fighting for just one farm. He will be fighting with the stories of all the others you've ruined. I've made sure of it. Your mistake was thinking I was just a sad old woman. You forgot I was a farmer. We know how to wait. We know how to plant seeds that will bloom long after we are gone. This is my harvest. Good luck. I read it 3 times. The stories of all the others. Something far more valuable than land. She hadn't just been playing defense, she'd been setting a trap. This changed everything. This wasn't a tragedy, it was a battle plan, and she had just handed it to me. I sat there in the moonlight, in the quiet of the barn, holding her last words in my hand. The grief and confusion I'd felt earlier was replaced by a surge of adrenaline, of fierce, protective love for this woman I had only half known. She wasn't a victim. She was a warrior, and she had just passed me her sword. But what was I supposed to do with it? The letter to Croft was a magnificent piece of defiance, but it wasn't proof of anything. I was still an 18-year-old kid with $47 and a mountain of legally binding debt. The development company that Croft now apparently worked for, a big corporate-sounding entity mentioned in the lawyer's letter, had teams of attorneys. I had a box of letters. A wave of despair washed over me, extinguishing the fire that had just been lit. It was hopeless. She had laid out this grand plan, but she'd overestimated me. I wasn't a fighter. I was a survivor. I knew how to keep my head down, how to not make waves, how to be invisible. That's how you get through the system. Fighting gets you nowhere. My phone buzzed in my pocket, making me jump. It was a text from an unknown number. Leo Vance, this is Arthur Finch. I got your message. My sincerest condolences on your grandmother's passing, belated as they are. I know the contents of my letter must have been a shock. Call me in the morning. There is more to discuss. Eleanor was a remarkable woman. I stared at the message. There is more to discuss. Maybe it wasn't hopeless. Maybe this lawyer, this Mr. Finch, was part of her plan too. I had a choice to make, right here, right now, sitting on this dusty floor. I could take the smart path. I could call Mr. Finch in the morning and tell him to arrange a surrender. Maybe the development company would forgive a portion of the debt in exchange for a clean title. Maybe I'd walk away with a few $1,000s, enough to get a room, get that job at the diner, and start the slow, grinding process of saving Maya. It was the sensible option, the safe option. Or I could choose the other path, the one my grandmother had laid out for me. The path of the fighter. The path that led through risk, uncertainty, and a battle against a powerful enemy. A path that could leave me with less than nothing. But it was also the path that honored her. It was the path that sought justice, not just for us, but for the others she mentioned. I looked at the letter to Croft again. You forgot I was a farmer. We know how to wait. We know how to plant seeds that will bloom long after we are gone. I thought about Maya, her voice on the phone, so full of fragile hope. Getting her out of the system wasn't just about providing a roof over her head. It was about giving her a home, a real one, a place with history, with roots, a place she could be proud of. This farm, this broken, debt-ridden, beautiful piece of land, was our home. It had been stolen from us by lies, both the enemies and our own families. Selling it for scraps felt like a betrayal of Grandma's fight, and a betrayal of the future Maya deserved. And that's when I knew. I couldn't walk away. I couldn't take the safe route. I had to fight. I didn't know how. I didn't know if we could win, but I had to try. For Grandma, for Maya, for the 14-year-old boy who never got to say a proper goodbye. I spent the rest of the night in that loft, not sleeping, but reading. I went through every single letter she had written, organizing them by the seasons she'd marked them with. It was a journal of her last year, a chronicle of her grief, her illness, her rage, and her brilliant, desperate plan. She wrote about me and Maya constantly. Memories of teaching me to fish in the creek, of Maya picking wildflowers in the meadow. Her love for us was the ink in her pen, the force that drove every word. It was painful to read, a love letter from beyond the grave. But it was also fortifying. It was a reminder of what was at stake. As dawn began to break, casting a soft gray light through the window, I came to the final letters, the ones from deep winter. They were different. The handwriting was weaker, but the words were more focused, more urgent. Leo, my time is short. I've hidden this box, but it is only the key. It is not the treasure itself. The real plan, the evidence I've collected, the means to truly fight back, that is buried elsewhere. I couldn't risk them finding it, not ever. You must find it. Don't trust the house. Don't trust the fields. Trust the one thing that has watched over this family for 100 years. Where the giant sleeps and points to the North Star, you will find our reclamation. It was a riddle. My heart sank. After all this, it came down to a riddle from a dying woman. Where the giant sleeps and points to the North Star. I read it over and over. What giant? The tractor? The barn itself? It felt too poetic, too vague. I was exhausted, my brain foggy with lack of sleep and emotional overload. I felt like I was right at the edge of the answer, but I couldn't see it. The first rays of sun hit the loft. I looked out the window, over the land. The fields were a mess of brown weeds and tangled blackberry bushes. And then I saw it, standing alone in the middle of the west pasture, about a quarter-mile away. The old oak tree. It was massive, one of the biggest I'd ever seen. We called it the giant when we were kids. Its trunk was gnarled and thick, like the leg of some prehistoric beast. It had been struck by lightning decades ago, and one of its largest branches, thick as a man's body, was dead and bare. It pointed straight up into the sky, north, where the giant sleeps and points to the North Star. It wasn't a riddle, it was a map. I grabbed the pry bar and a shovel I'd seen leaning against the barn wall. Adrenaline surged through me, a jolt of pure, unadulterated hope. I half ran, half stumbled through the wet, overgrown field, the rising sun at my back. The grass was waist-high in places, soaking my jeans with cold dew. When I reached the tree, I was out of breath. It was even bigger up close. The ground around its base was a tangle of exposed roots, like thick, sleeping serpents. Her letter said to find our reclamation. I started searching the ground around the north side of the trunk. The ground was hard, compacted. I kicked at the dirt, scraped it with the shovel. Nothing. I felt a pang of despair. Had I been wrong? Was this just a wild goose chase? I leaned against the trunk, catching my breath, and looked up at the dead branch pointing to the sky. My eyes followed it down the trunk to the ground. And that's when I saw it. A rock. It was a simple, flat river stone, no different from 1,000 others in the creek bed. But it was placed deliberately, nestled between two large roots, in a spot that was slightly too perfect, too neat. It wasn't a natural placement. I knelt and pried the stone up with my fingers. Underneath, the dirt was softer, looser. I dug with my hands at first, then with the shovel. The digging was hard work. The ground was thick with clay and smaller roots. My back ached. My hands, soft from 2 years of indoor life, started to blister. But I didn't stop. I dug with a frantic energy, fueled by the feeling that I was just inches away. After about 2 feet, the shovel hit something with a dull, metallic thud. Not the sharp clang of rock, a deep, hollow sound. My heart leaped into my throat. I dropped the shovel and clawed at the remaining dirt with my bare hands. It was another box. This one was much larger than the ammo can. It was a heavy-duty steel footlocker, the kind the military uses. It was wrapped in thick plastic sheeting, sealed with duct tape. My grandmother had waterproofed it. It took all my strength to haul it out of the hole. It was incredibly heavy. I tore at the plastic, my fingers raw and clumsy. The footlocker was locked with a heavy padlock. For a second, I panicked, but then I remembered the ammo can. Tucked into the very bottom, beneath all the letters, had been a small, single key on a piece of twine. I hadn't known what it was for. Now I did. I ran all the way back to the barn, my lungs burning, grabbed the key, and ran back to the tree. My hand was shaking so much I could barely fit the key into the lock. It turned. With a click, the padlock sprang open. I took a deep breath, like a diver about to go under, and I lifted the heavy lid. The contents were packed with military precision. On top was a thick, waterproof folder. I opened it. Inside was the original deed to the farm, dated 1952, signed by my great-grandparents. And underneath it, another document, a reconveyance deed. It was a legal document showing that the original mortgage on the farm had been paid off in full in 1988. The farm was owned, free and clear. The loans from Silas Croft, from Apex Financial, they weren't secured by the property itself. They were personal loans, leveraged against a property that was already paid for. Croft hadn't been a mortgage lender. He'd been a loan shark with fancy paperwork. He had no legal claim to the land itself, only to the debt. It was a crucial distinction, one I was only just beginning to understand. But my grandmother had understood it perfectly. Underneath the folder was the real treasure. It was a stack of files, each one neatly labeled with a name. The Andersons, Mr. Gable, the Rodriguez family. Inside each file were copies of loan documents from Apex Financial, sworn affidavits, and heartbreaking personal letters. My grandmother hadn't just been fighting for herself. She had spent the last years of her life tracking down other victims of Silas Croft's scheme. She had been building a case. She had collected their stories, their evidence. She had become a one-woman army, fighting a quiet war from her failing farmhouse. And at the very bottom of the box, wrapped in an oilcloth, was cash. Bundles of it. 20s, 50s, hundreds. I didn't count it all, but I could tell it was a lot. More than enough to pay the back property taxes. More than enough to hire a real lawyer. In one of her last letters, she had explained it. It was the money from the final loans she'd taken from Croft. She hadn't spent it on medical bills. She'd hidden it. She had taken the enemy's money and turned it into a war chest for her grandson. I sank to my knees. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of her plan washed over me. The love and trust it represented. She hadn't just left me a problem to solve. She had left me everything I needed to win. The keys, the map, the evidence, and the funding. She'd left me a reclamation. That morning, I didn't just call Arthur Finch. I walked back into town, my clothes covered in mud, and I walked into the Oak Ridge Public Library. I used their computer to scan every single document from my grandmother's files. The affidavits, the predatory loan agreements, her unsent letter to Croft. I saved it all to a cheap USB drive I bought at the drugstore. Then I went to a payphone and called Mr. Finch. This time, my voice was different. It wasn't the voice of a scared kid. "Mr. Finch," I said, "my name is Leo Vance. I'm at the farm. We need to talk about Silas Croft and a company called Sterling Development." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Sterling Development was the company that had been listed in his letter as the primary creditor, the one that had bought up Apex Financial's toxic assets. "Mr. Vance," he said slowly, his voice cautious, "how do you know those names?" "My grandmother was a very thorough woman," I said. "I have everything. The original deed, evidence of loan fraud. I have the stories of a dozen other families he's ruined. And I have the letter she wrote to him. I think it's time we delivered it." There was a long silence. I could hear the faint sound of him breathing. When he finally spoke, the caution in his voice was gone, replaced by something that sounded like awe. "Good Lord, Eleanor," he whispered, as if to himself. Then to me, "Mr. Vance, Leo, don't go anywhere. I'm getting in my car. I'll be there in 3 hours." The aftermath was a blur. Arthur Finch turned out to be more than just a lawyer. He was an old friend of my grandmother's. He'd helped her with the will and had suspected she was up to something, but she had kept the full extent of her plan a secret, even from him. When he saw the evidence I'd uncovered, his face was a mixture of grief and profound respect. "She was always 10 steps ahead of everyone," he said, shaking his head as he looked over the files. The fight wasn't a fight at all. It was an execution. Finch's firm took the case pro bono. They didn't just threaten a lawsuit. They threatened federal wire fraud charges, a class action suit that would bankrupt Sterling Development, and a media blitz that would have put Silas Croft's face on every news channel in the state. Croft and his company folded instantly. It was a full surrender. All debts against the estate were forgiven. The liens were cleared. Furthermore, they agreed to pay a substantial settlement into a fund, administered by Finch's firm, to compensate the other families my grandmother had identified. They didn't do it out of morality. They did it to avoid prison. 2 weeks later, I stood in a sterile courtroom, not as a ward of the state, but as a petitioner. Arthur Finch stood beside me. On the other side of the room, Maya sat with her social worker. She looked small and scared. I had explained everything to her over the phone, but I knew it didn't sound real. When the judge called my name, I stepped forward. I presented my case. I was 18. I was the legal owner of a 40-acre property, free and clear. I presented a bank statement showing the cash my grandmother had left, now deposited and legitimate. I had a home. I had means. I could provide for my sister. The judge, a woman with tired but kind eyes, looked over my file. She looked at me. She looked at Maya. "You've been through a great deal, Mr. Vance," she said. "Your grandmother, she would be very proud of you." Then she looked at Maya. "Do you wish to live with your brother?" Maya stood up. For the first time, I saw a flicker of the fierce Vance spirit in her eyes. The same spirit that had been in my grandmother's. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and strong. "More than anything." The judge smiled, a genuine warm smile. She stamped a document. "Guardianship granted." The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. It was over. We had won. I walked across the courtroom to Maya, and for the first time in 2 years, I hugged my sister without a supervisor watching. She buried her face in my chest, and we both cried, not with sadness, but with a relief so profound it felt like the earth was reforming under our feet. We were free. We were together. We were home. The work was just beginning. The farm was still a wreck. The house needed a new roof, new plumbing, new everything. The fields were still a jungle. But it was our wreck. It was our jungle. The first week Maya was there, we didn't do any major repairs. We just cleaned. We swept the dust of abandonment out of the house. We cleared the trash and the graffiti. We took the tattered tarp off the roof. And we spent every evening in the loft of the barn, just talking. We talked about Grandma, about the past 2 years, about the future. We read her letters together. Maya cried when she read them, but she also laughed. "She was a secret agent," Maya said one night, looking out the loft window at the stars. "A spy, and she left us a secret mission." I smiled. "Yeah, I guess she did." I finally understood what she had meant in her last letter. Home isn't just a place you inherit. It's a story. And for a while, I thought our story was a tragedy about loss and abandonment. I was wrong. My grandmother had taken that story, and she had rewritten it. She had turned a story of victimhood into an epic of resistance. A story of debt into a story of inheritance. A story of an ending into the story of our beginning. She didn't abandon us. She armed us. She didn't leave us a burden. She left us a choice. The choice to accept the story we were told, or the choice to dig deeper, to find the truth, and to fight for the story we deserved. And her love, that fierce, stubborn, brilliant love, was the treasure she had buried. It was the weapon, the map, and the home all at once. And now it was ours to build upon. This story, our story, isn't about the money we won in a settlement or the land we got back. It's about what it means to reclaim your own narrative. It's about looking at a situation that seems hopeless and choosing to believe there's another layer, another truth buried underneath. So many of us are handed stories about ourselves, that we're broken, that we're not enough, that we're victims of our circumstances. But my grandmother taught me that we have the power to be the authors of our own lives. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening. This journey was one of the hardest of my life, but sharing it makes the burden lighter. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever had to fight for your family or rewrite the story you were handed, I'd be honored if you'd subscribe to the channel. We're building a community here of people who understand that the most beautiful things are often the ones we have to rebuild. And please, in the comments below, I'd love to hear from you. Tell me about a time you chose the harder right over the easier wrong. Or tell me about a person in your life who was a secret warrior, someone who protected you in ways you only understood later. I read every comment. Your stories matter. They are part of this larger story we are all writing together. Thank you for being a part of mine.